All right, today we're jumping into a really striking cautionary tale from religious scripture. It's the story of an entire village of people who, as a divine punishment, were transformed into monkeys.
So that immediately brings up a pretty wild question, right? Could something like this actually happen? To really get the message behind this incredible event, we first have to unpack the story itself.
So, here's what we're going to break down. We'll look at who these people were and the pretty amazing life they had. Then, we'll get into the specific rule they broke, what happened to them, and finally, we'll tackle that big question. Does this story have any connection at all to the monkeys we see in the world today?
Okay, let's set the scene. Our story takes place during the time of the prophet Dawood, who you probably know as David, and it's all about a community that was, by every measure, incredibly blessed. So picture this, a bustling seaside village called Elah, home to about 70,000 people. The story describes them as a happy, obedient society, living this idyllic life with lush gardens all around. And being a coastal town, their entire livelihood was built on a supply of fish that just seemed endless. Yeah, life was good.
But you know how it goes. When things are that good, sometimes people can get a little complacent. And pretty soon, their obedience was about to be put to the ultimate test by a single divine command. And here is where that test comes in. The rule was simple. You cannot fish on Saturday, the Sabbath. But, and this is a huge but, there was a major twist. On that one forbidden day, the fish would be everywhere, practically leaping onto the shore. But on every other day, they were almost impossible to find. It was a perfect storm, pitting their faith directly against this massive, almost irresistible temptation. So, what do you think they did? Well, their response involved some clever deception, outright disobedience, and ultimately a decision that would tear their entire society apart. Faced with this dilemma, some of the villagers came up with a very clever plan. A plan the narrative says was whispered to them by Satan. It was a workaround, a loophole designed to get all the fish they could ever want without technically fishing on the Sabbath. Here's how their little trick worked. First, they dug these big canals from the sea into some large ponds they'd made inland. On Saturday, when the fish were swarming, they just opened the canals and the fish would pour right into the ponds. Then they'd seal the entrances, trapping them. Come Sunday, all they had to do was stroll over and collect this massive catch. So no, they weren't technically casting nets on Saturday, but were they really honoring the spirit of the law?
Now this trick completely split the nation into three distinct groups. First, you had the disobedient, the ones who were openly using this method and getting rich. Then you had the protesters, who loudly said this was evil and even built a wall to separate themselves from the sinners. And finally, there were the silent, the people who knew it was wrong but just didn't say or do anything about it.
This open rebellion, which the story says involved about 12,000 people, did not go unnoticed. In fact, it prompted a very severe divine reaction. The story says that the prophet Dawood warned them again and again, pleading with them to stop, but they wouldn't listen. And finally, angered by their stubborn defiance, he cursed them.
And this all leads to a truly pivotal line from the Quran, the holy book of Islam, which marks the exact moment of their transformation. The divine command was issued, "Be monkeys."
The aftermath was just swift and grim. The transformed people lived for only 3 days. In that time, they couldn't eat or drink anything. The story says they could still recognize their human relatives and would come up to them crying, but they were totally unable to speak. After those 3 days were up, every single one of them died.
So this incredible tragic story leads to one final, lingering question, one that the source material actually addresses directly. Is there any connection between these people and the monkeys we have in the world today? So the narrative gives a very clear theological answer to this. The principle is that when a group of people is transformed as a divine punishment, their lineage ends right there. It doesn't continue. They perish completely. So from this point of view, the monkeys we see today are an entirely separate creation with no biological link to the people in this story. So what are we supposed to make of a story like this? It really leaves us with a final question to think about. Is this simply a straightforward lesson about the importance of obedience? Or is it maybe a more complex commentary on human ingenuity and how easily we can use our own cleverness to justify breaking the spirit of the very rules we claim to be following? That's something to chew on.